This was a horrible crime. A young girl, a child, died brutally. Her family understandably wanted justice. Well, this event in 1996 Baltimore City, and an entire city wanted justice.
Over the past year, this podcast has taken me out of my comfort zone. I've gone down paths I didn't want to travel and researched things that I had no desire to know about. But despite those things, I couldn't walk away. There are so many twists and turns in this story, and a theme of injustice that compelled me to share. When a judge makes this statement,
I don't know what the facts are of this case. I am not the jury of this man's guilt or innocence. But I know a Brady violation when I see one, and this is pretty clearly a Brady violation.
Before writing in his ruling that, quote, the state put on a circumstantial case in which much of their evidence was disputed, and the results of which, he went on to say, was a verdict unworthy of any confidence. At some point, I'm not sure when, this journey also became about my desperation for answers. It could be that
In this entirely circumstantial case against the defendant, the only issue was when that death occurred.
But it doesn't feel that simple to me. I need to know, how can the path to justice become so broken that the cracks in the system are so blatantly obvious, even to a regular person, like me? So spoiler alert, I'm not a famous radio personality, and what you're about to listen to was not produced in an NPR studio. As a matter of fact, it wasn't produced in a studio at all. Brought to you from the walk-in closet in my bedroom. I'm Brooke, and this is episode 1 of Convicted. The Adventures of Pinocchio, the version with real people. You know, the one with Jonathan Taylor Thomas. It was released in theaters on July 26, 1996. It was very similar to the animated classic. A man makes a puppet that he wants to be a real boy, and the puppet comes to life and makes some questionable choices. However, in the way of Disney movies, he learns his lesson and father and son get a happy ending. The story that was unfolding in Theater 7 at the Golden Ring Mall in Baltimore was much more tragic than the fairy tale that flickered on the screen. On that same date, at around 6:30 p.m., Richard Nicolas picked up his 2-year-old daughter, Asia, from her mother's house. This was their very first and only outing alone together. The two were off to see what they thought was going to be a 7 p.m. showing of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. When they arrived at the theater, Mr. Nicholas realized he'd made a mistake, the same one that I'd made several times before the internet became my source of entertainment information. The last day of The Hunchback of Notre Dame was on Thursday, and because it was Friday, different movies were being played at different times. To make the best of the situation, they ended up buying a ticket to Pinocchio at around 6:50 p.m. for the 8 p.m. showing of the movie. Richard and his daughter proceeded to pass the time walking around the mall. He gave her some change for machines with prizes and plastic eggs, and most notably, they stopped in a photo booth to take a picture together at either 7:03 or 7:43 p.m. The movie ended at 9:45 p.m., and then minutes later at 9:54 p.m., a 911 call was made from a Texaco station a few miles from where the movie had been playing. 2-year-old Asia Nicholas had been shot while on the way home from the theater.
You know, the story that he explained to the police and explained to trial was that he got followed by a rogue road rage driver, and instead of driving his car to safety, he ends up driving his car down a desolate road, Bowley's Lane.
It was 1996. Mr. Nicholas didn't have a cell phone, and the light from the sign at the station had caught his attention. At the scene, Officer Hannah ordered Asia to be removed from the car, an action which was contrary to police protocol. The child was placed on the ground, and Richard removed his shirt and gently put it behind her head. But it was too late. Asia was dead. Mr. Nicholas was taken to the station, where he was interrogated and arrested for the murder of his own daughter by Detective Massey. Later, at the trial, the state claimed that Mr. Nicholas didn't want the little girl, that he'd asked that the child be aborted before she was even legally a living, breathing human being. They said that he casually ignored his financial obligations by denying child support payments. And he even took out a life insurance policy on her, for which he was the beneficiary. Ultimately, what was believed to be the linchpin in the state's case was when an expert witness appeared to imply that the little girl had been dead for 2 hours before the 911 call was placed. But really,
there's nothing about this story over here that supports the state's theory about a shooting that happened 2 hours earlier.
His defense attorneys, Christina Gutierrez, Howard Cardin, and Arthur Cheslock, appeared to be a dream team of defenders. His family and friends, denying any possibility of his guilt, rallied to raise money for his defense. That dream turned into a nightmare when the jury found him guilty after a case that lasted more than 2 weeks, and they deliberated only slightly more than 2 hours. Guilty, despite the fact that there was no weapon found after an extensive search of the crime scene and surrounding areas. Guilty, even though the science used to point the finger at Mr. Nicolas was later said to be, in a word, false. Mr. Nicolas is currently serving a life sentence in a maximum security prison in Maryland. He's been incarcerated for more than 20 years, and despite appeals and petitions and post-convictions and other legal documents passed from the circuit court to the Court of Special Appeals to the district court to the federal appeals court and then back again, things aren't looking so great for Richard. And really, why should they be? Why are we even talking about the prospects of a convicted murderer who is spending the rest of his life in prison? The thing is, what if he didn't do it?
Well, I worked on his case pretty solidly for about 1.5 years, and that began in 2008, and I've been in constant, regular contact with him till the present day, even though I'm not actively working on his case at the moment.
So what were your original impressions of the case?
Well, when I received the appointment from the federal court, it came with the judge's statement that he believed this was a case of actual innocence. And so obviously my ears perked up, and I became immediately compelled to learn more. And I, too, formulated the opinion early on that this was a case that definitely could be one of actual innocence, and certainly was one where Mr. Nicolas was denied a fair trial, and also was a case that had so many questions that remained unanswered.
How often does a judge come to you and say, I think this person is innocent?
Well, never.
Never. That was Rachel Kamens.
My name's Rachel Kamens. I'm one of Richard Nicolas's former attorneys. I work at a law firm doing criminal defense work.
But it's not just the legal community that believes that his trial had issues. Family members and friends alike all seem to share this opinion. He couldn't have done this. Not Richard. If you're at all familiar with podcasts, you probably recognized at least a couple of the names that I mentioned earlier, like Detective Massey. And if not, you'll want to, because he's important to this story. Here's another name, Christina Gutierrez. Does that sound familiar? If not, a quick Google search will bring you up to speed on her triumphs and tribulations before her disbarment in 2001 and ultimate passing in 2004. Ironically, while you're making this search, consider that Richard Nicolas has never used the internet. Can you even remember a time before some part of your day wasn't spent gathering information online? The picture is probably starting to come into focus now, and you can tell that more than just the projection machine was distorting things in the courtroom during the trial. There are other people in this story. Some you're going to want to remember, and some maybe you'll want to forget. This is a story worth listening to. Because no matter your opinion on Mr. Nicolas's innocence or guilt, it becomes obvious that
this was not a fair trial.
Bias is human nature, and by having a jury of our peers, we are given better odds at a less biased adjudication. But there are so many pieces that fit together to make a trial, so many factors that need to be taken into consideration, so many humans with their own emotions and biases are involved, that I sometimes wonder if a fair trial is possible at all. The process has become more diverse, but even with the advances that are being made in modern society, I sometimes think that the prospect of a fair trial is a myth. And with all the instructions that a jury receives and all the training and experience that attorneys and eventual judges have, can biases be eliminated or even just pushed aside? I'm human too, and to deliver a story without any bias, I believe would be next to impossible. But I must tell you, as the story progressed, and as I accrued more information, my emotions had been on a roller coaster. But my opinion on the injustice of this conviction has not wavered. We can be fairly certain of our likelihood of intentionally committing a serious crime. But there is one thing we cannot predict with any degree of certainty, and that is our likelihood of being convicted of one. That fact terrifies me. Having read the thousands of pages of transcripts about this trial, I still cannot fathom how a guilty verdict was reached. The story that I told you so far has been compelling, but some of the details of this case that I haven't mentioned yet are the most disturbing. What happened to Asia, and what could possibly motivate someone to shoot a child? This podcast is an exploration into the case of Richard Nicolas and how he was convicted. I'm not a reporter, and I'm not an attorney, though I've read enough legal documents and learned enough Latin that I'm starting to feel like one. I'm a social worker, a person by profession and an internal drive for social justice is wired to advocate for those who can't advocate for themselves. This story came to me from Rachel, and she is an attorney who also was directed to this case by chance.
In 2008, Richard had filed a pro se federal habeas petition, which was seeking a new trial in federal court. And he had done it, pro se means that he filed it on his own without a lawyer. And he had asked for counsel to be appointed. And the court agreed to appoint him an attorney. And they reached out to me as an attorney in the community who had handled federal habeas cases in the past and asked me if I would take on his case.
Rachel is one of the smartest people I've ever met, and she contacted me after I had interviewed her for another podcast. Over the course of that interaction, I had mentioned my desire to help in a more direct way.
After Richard lost his case in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, I was considering taking another look at his case to see if there were any remaining remedies to pursue. And you had mentioned to me during our work on your Actual Innocence podcast that you might be interested in actually volunteering your time and maybe even getting some of your connections to volunteer their time on a case involving injustice or actual innocence. So I reached out to see if you would be willing to be my intern on Richard's case and assist me with some research and investigation. And you said yes, and here we are.
I made a trip to Maryland to look through the mountains of boxes of information on Richard's case. Inside, I found hundreds of letters to different attorneys that had represented him throughout the years. There was one to a public defender who, after many letters, informed Richard that he was no longer going to be employed in his current position and that his new attorney would be contacting him once they were assigned. That public defender became another, and then another, and then another, each wishing him well as they resigned from their positions. Richard's letters were mostly written on legal paper, and the tone became increasingly desperate for answers with each yellow letter. I noticed that more than a couple of the letters ended with the phrase, "What's going on out there?" followed by an exclamation point. In one of the particularly large file folders, I noticed a letter from Richard that basically said, this isn't a quote, "I was tired of waiting, so I wrote the motion myself. Please take a look at it." I have a type A personality. I like to be on top of things. And I can't imagine what it must feel like to be locked away and have to depend on strangers to fill you in on the status of your freedom. The letters in the box I was looking through reminded me of the letters I had received from Richard since starting my investigation. Sometimes they were just letters, and other times they included pictures or other documents relevant to the case. One time, I got a large manila envelope with a stack of certificates that Richard had earned, including one that certified him as a paralegal. In another box, there was a bundle of photographs of the crime scene. There were pictures of street signs and nearby lights and businesses and the car, but then I came across one that I was not expecting, one that took my breath away. It was of the car, but on the ground next to it was a white sheet with a small black braid poking out of the top. Asia. When I say this podcast took me places I never thought I would go, I mean that literally. One day, I found myself a visitor of a Maryland State Correctional Institution. Here's a concise description of my prison visit. It was not what I expected. I'll elaborate more in the next episode, but to give you a glimpse of what the visit was like, I will say, after several layers of security and overcoming the fear that my underclothes were going to set off a metal detector, I sat across the glass from a man that only barely resembled the pictures of the young Richard Nicolas that I'd seen the day before. Richard is now 51 years old, and he's sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison, with no chance of parole. Next to death, that's the most severe punishment a person can receive. Over the past year, I've talked with him on almost a weekly basis, and I have nothing negative to say. After talking to his friends and family, I get the sense that he was well liked, and that his conviction was a shock to everyone. Rachel was correct when she later told me she thought I would be fascinated by this case. At this point, it's probably better described as an obsession, and it's only intensified as more information becomes available to me. This man, who was once described as pure evil in a newspaper article outlining this case, has perplexed me, because I just can't see it. And the mystery of what those 12 individuals in the jury box saw that I'm missing is tormenting me. Is he such a fantastical actor that he's conned me and everyone I've talked with about this case? I met his Aunt Gloria and his friend Hinda in a local restaurant, hence the noises in the background, and they shared the opinion that Richard is a friendly person who always is laughing.
And he was always like life of party. He would like do the stupid things, like people would challenge him to like race eating a sub with like one of the Dobermans or something. I mean, he would do stuff. Yeah, it was a Doberman, him against the Doberman eating a cheesesteak sub. So he would, he was fun and he would do stuff like that. And he laughs a lot.
He always laughed. I think he got that from his mother.
This is Richard's little sister. I use the phrase little lightly, as I would guess she was almost a foot taller than me.
And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know if this is a bad joke. My brother wouldn't kill a fly, much less his daughter. My God. And this went on for a few hours. They never let me talk to my brother. But I knew that whatever they were saying was not my brother. He was a EMT. He jumped out of the ambulance one day on the way to a run because this man was beating on this woman. But that's my brother. So to go from that to why did he kill his daughter? I'm like, what?
Some people spend their evenings swiping right or left to communicate with other people. But over many months now, I've used my time pressing 0 to accept a call.
You have a prepaid call. You will not be charged for this call. This call is from
Richard Nicolas,
an inmate at a Maryland Correctional Facility. This call will be recorded and monitored. To accept this call, press 0 now. To decline this call, thank you for using Global Tail Link.
I want a disclaimer. The next conversation that you hear was recorded with the permission of both people on the call. And after I was passed around by email from the warden to the social worker at the prison and back, I started consulting handbooks and online rules, and I couldn't find any written guidelines prohibiting such a recording. There's something that you'll come to realize about Richard. He has a fairly pronounced stutter. It's been with him since he was a child. This speech impediment is a part of his case, a part of the story, and it's also a part of Richard. But I'll let him tell you about it.
Actually, French was my original language. I was actually born at Sinai Hospital. Then the family moved up to Canada. Sinai Hospital is in Baltimore, Maryland. Then we moved up to Canada, stayed up there for a little while, a few years. Then I had gotten asthma really, really bad. So my father took me home, which was Haiti. My father's Haitian. Then after that, we had moved back to my mom's home with her sisters, which was, Baltimore, Maryland. So during that English speaking process, I, started stuttering my head off, and I remember, and when I came down to the United States, I was taught English, and during that language changing process, that's when my speech impediment came forth for some reason. I don't know why. With my speech impediment, it comes from a birthing accident. I was told that I kept on trying to come out feet first, and my baby doctor, lack of a better word, reached in with a pair of forceps, and he grabbed my head and out head first. Well, what he did was he bent my head, which damaged my speech center. So I was told that when they taught me English, going to a whole lot of speech therapists and really having some serious issues all through elementary school. It was a horrible handicap that I obviously still, suffer from, but that's how it started.
Throughout my talks with Richard, I've noticed that every word is slow and deliberate, a skill that was taught to him during years of speech therapy as a child. Being able to talk, to finish a sentence without really having to focus on the words, is something that many of us take for granted. When I spoke to Richard in person, I noticed that when he was struggling to get a word out, he would open his eyes wide and really concentrate on what he was saying, something that a majority of us do not have to worry about. Richard's sister, Mary, told me a story of Richard's father's attempts to help him overcome his speech issues, using marbles.
My father would work with him on the weekends and in the evenings to help him. I remember something about my father used to put marbles in his mouth and have him speak with the marbles in his mouth. And I think the reason for doing that was so that he would be so busy worrying about not swallowing a marble that he would slow himself down to speak.
That's interesting.
Yeah, for some reason, marbles stick out in my mind. And then I would get jealous because my father, who was my soul, was giving more attention to my brother than to me. So then my father wouldn't put marbles in my mouth, but he'd make me read too in the corner quietly. Well, so the significant part of the childhood was the marbles and the reading.
The reason that I bring this up at all, beyond the fact that this is a podcast and an audio production, will become relevant soon enough. Because, as part of their case against him, the state claimed that Richard spoke too calmly and did not act traumatized enough following the death of his daughter. Which, in my professional opinion, is complete bullshit. There is no appropriate reaction to trauma. Especially when you take into consideration, had he not slowed himself, he might not have been able to speak at all. At his original trial, when he was asked if he disliked his stutter, he testified, quote, "No, it's just the way I was made." And I talked with Richard about the modern miracle of audio editing and stutters, and this is what he had to say.
I'd rather you leave it all in, just because of the fact that if you have some guy saying that he stutters, but he never stutters, it's you know, I'm not ashamed at all of my speech impediment. If you can see me face to face, you can see what my techniques are to get my words out. It really is quite an effort at times, but that's just, you know, how things are. So I'm not ashamed of how, you know, God made me. So it's you know, let them have the whole thing. It's I think that the big part of this type of thing is to let people see the whole picture. So give them the whole thing.
In one of the boxes of evidence, I found a document labeled Institutional Progress Report, which reminds me of the report cards I had received in high school. It stated the names of the institutions in which Mr. Nicolas had been housed and all the work positions that he had held: library aide, furniture shop, recreation worker, and others. It also had a space for rule violations, in which he only had one infraction. And written at the bottom, in the other information space, it says, quote, "Institutional adjustment record reveals only one infraction in 17 years, which is quite remarkable considering the violent element that is confined behind the walls of maximum security housing." Unquote. I mean, I think it would be accurate for Richard to say,
I've been a model inmate all these years.
Richard's never heard a podcast. He's never owned a smartphone, or any cell phone for that matter. And I wanted to make sure that he was aware that no matter how compelling a case or evidence presented might be, there are always people on both sides of the fence. When I do a podcast, some people might not believe you. And because of that, I'm going to have to ask you questions that make us both uncomfortable. And I just want to make sure that you're prepared for that.
I can take that.
It's probably naive of me to think that someone who's been incarcerated for 20 years needs my warning that someone, or several someones, won't believe him. Richard's been helpful and willing to talk with me throughout the creation of this series, even though he'll likely not be able to listen himself. I told Richard I was creating a website for the podcast to share evidence with the listeners, so he sent me some pictures. You can see them at convictedpod.com.
It really never dawned on me that for a podcast, I just pictured like a radio show thing that people are going to have something to look at too, you know, so I never really thought of it.
Well, and usually with a podcast comes a website, like on the internet, especially cases like yours. People like to do their own investigating.
That's interesting.
I'd like to remind you that this isn't just a story. It's real people with real lives and real trauma and real heartbreak. Please be respectful of that. So we have almost a minute left. Funny story about
seconds remaining.
See, I'm right on time.
Good call. How about if I call back next Sunday and we'll pick it up from there?
As I got up to leave the prison after visiting Richard the first time, he thanked me for considering telling his story. And then he said something I'll never forget. Adnan Syed is on my block. I know the power of a podcast. Who is Richard Nicolas? Next time on Convicted. Thanks for listening. Convicted will be back in 2 weeks' time, and after that will be released on a weekly basis. You can see pictures and other documents at convictedpod.com. Convicted is hosted and produced by me, with music and scoring by Blake Maples. You can see and hear his work at blakemaples.com. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating and review on your podcast app, and be sure to subscribe so you're the first to hear the next episode of Convicted.
I like classic rock and roll, plus jazz music, Miles Davis, John Coltrane. Back in my younger days, I used to like to go to Crosby, Stills and Nash concerts, and I've seen Genesis, a whole bunch of times. Rush.
Wow, you're old.
Yeah, I am.